Hey there folks, so welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from Frank Turner, titled Positive Songs for Negative People. On some level, punk is always going to be a young person's genre. You all know this. The raw anger, the focus on passion and energy over meticulous craftsmanship, the vitriolic power and passion with maybe some of the nuance coming later. All this shows up most in the heady rush of youth, and that kind of makes sense. They're too young to know any better. So what happens when punk grows up and encounters the crushing weight and occasional depression of adulthood? Well, any number of things can happen. Some will keep the punk faith and keep on in the scene. Some will fade out of the scene naturally as they grow up. Some will double down and rage all the harder. And some will opt to refine their simpler songs into something with a little bit more weight or maturity or complexity. As such, it's not all that surprising that some punks will drift towards folk rock or rock operas or even alternative country, trading in explosive energy for tighter songwriting and more grandiose presentation. And one of the best examples of this, Frank Turner, who initially started off in post-hardcore before going solo and making highly lyrical yet no less passionate folk rock that is drenched in the grubby pub tradition that drew upon Celtic folk, disillusioned punk, and even hints of alternative country and piano rock. And there's a lot to really like about his brand of abrasive yet very confessional songwriting, his clever knack for great hooks, and his eclectic hodgepodge of influences that are half tongue-in-cheek and yet often are played completely sincerely. For me, my favorite album of Turner's is easily his second album, Love, Ire, and Psalm, as it felt like it brought the most instrumental flavor and excellently crafted songs to the table while still maintaining that punk edge and passion. If I can find areas where he stumbles, though, it'd be some of his material can get a little bit sleepy and lacking in momentum, which would probably be my biggest criticism of his third album, or that his newest records can occasionally feel a little bit too polished, especially in his vocal production. But none of that was going to stop me from reviewing his newest album, Positive Songs for Negative People. Sounds like it was made for me. So, does it live up to its title? You see, it's kind of funny. Positive Songs for Negative People is the sort of record that would normally kind of exasperate me, because it represents Frank Turner's biggest, broadest, and most uncomplicated album to date, a distilling of his formula into a record with soaring crunch that would play far better in arenas than most pubs. The sort of album where if it wasn't for Frank Turner's adamant refusal, there would have been a Taylor Swift cameo that would have actually had a chance of becoming a hit. And yet, at the same time, the formula that I've come to love, it's still here. Sure, it's nowhere near as refined and thus doesn't land the sharp impact of Frank Turner's best work, but it still works and it's got a lot of charm to it. And while I definitely hesitate to include this among Frank Turner's best albums, it's not there. It's got the energy his worst material lacks, and overall comes across into a pretty damn good, pretty damn enjoyable album. So let's start with the obvious positives, most of which are tied to Frank Turner himself. The guy's always had a knack for a killer, crowd-pleasing chorus that plays off of deceptively simple melodies driven into layered guitars and pianos, and considering how much of this album delivers just for that, it's no surprise that it does really well, with Turner's punk-inspired shouting vocals bringing a ton of visceral energy and focus. And yet on the few quieter moments, he proves he's still got the expressiveness to sell moments of heartfelt melancholy, and with the inclusion of a bigger backing chorus, which includes some established artists like Billy the Kid, Jacqueline Monroe, and even Lindy Ortega, who I covered just last week, his songs are bigger and heavier and more operatic and cinematic than ever, and yet to some extent this is a mixed blessing across the board, and where it's most noticed is in the production, handled by longtime pop rock producer Butch Walker, who's worked with a swath of mainstream accessible acts including Panic at the Disco, Fall Out Boy, Weezer, Taylor Swift, Pink, and Avril Lavigne. And you can definitely tell. The guitars have more burly, roiling, polished presence. The mix balance is impeccably even, especially with the bass guitar adding the foundation of the verses to complement the acoustic guitar. And even as pianos and organs and even horns on mittens cascade through the mix to complement the grooves, all of it is compressed together to drive the main primary underlying melody, which honestly is a little bit frustrating. When you have so many distinctive voices filling up your backing choir, and some really good voices at that, you think that Turner and Walker might have given them some unique interweaving harmonies to highlight more of them, or given unique instruments a little bit more room to breathe and rise above the massive sound for more than just a solo. We do get a bit of this, the tight rollick of the guitar melody, a slight shift in the underlying piano chords to the next storm, the organ supplementing the great gospel swell in the chorus and the great melodic groove of Glorious You, the crazed punk wildness of Out of Breath that still has a solid foundation if you dig for it in the pianos, and a great smoldering groove on the second verse, the acoustic and electric guitars balancing perfectly with the piano flourishes on Demons, to the stellar pianos driving the incredibly tight strumming on Love 40 Down. But even with those moments, there's an odd feeling of sameness here, as not many instrumental digressions venturing into folk or country or Celtic elements, and the few that we do have, not really getting the same room to breathe. In other words, this album sounds more homogeneous than it really should, and that does kind of bother me. And believe it or not, I'd say much of the same thing about the songwriting, most of which is thematically exploring the concept of weathering the worst to come just to back up all the stronger. Natural follow-up to the breakup themes of 2013's Tape Deck Heart. Lyrically, it's still chock full of the literary references to T.S. Eliot and Pascal and Napoleon and Beethoven that you would expect from Turner, recontextualized into instantly understandable nuggets of wisdom as he writes about how to rise from rough times into the sunshine. In other words, it's the perfect theme for an anthemic rock record. You almost expect it. Of course, it wouldn't be a Frank Turner album if he didn't make it slightly more complicated, making his narrative more desperate and confused and complicated, as he admits it's far from easy to rise from the ashes on songs like The Next Storm and Love 40 Down, and it's often a road you'll have to walk alone, like on Mittens, where he meets up the hard realization that the girl that he's in love with doesn't treat him with the same interest or passion. But all of it is done under the professions that life, be it living hard and fast, making deals with demons only to double-cross him and keep rushing along, to meet death out of breath because you've run there, tell him he's late and then fire him. All of that must be worth it because that life is worth it. It's why many consider Silent Key the penultimate moment of this album, a fictionalized account of the message that Kristen McLeod could have broadcasted before her death in the Challenger explosion. That even as she dies, she screams that she lived, got to rise to the heavens, soar to the unknown, be an astronaut. And then you get her segment, provided by folk singer Esme Patterson, where the only peace she needed came with death. And yet it's better not to have that piece if it means life in exchange or providing something for another. And it's one of the moments why the album closer, Song for Josh, hits so hard, as Turner sings a stripped-down acoustic ballad about a friend who took his own life, and now he wishes that he could have been there to provide even a modicum of support, having been to that brink in his own right. It links back to the underlying arc of this album that I really like. You might have to ride this rough life alone, but you sure as hell don't want to. And if you can provide that solace and comfort to a friend, or even a family member or relative, it can be all the more important. And if all of that, what I described, feels a little bit broad and a little bit corny, well, yeah, it is. But then when you backed it up with such raw sincerity, that can redeem a lot. But all that being said, despite thematic cohesion, I can't help but feel that we've seen Turner tread over a lot of this ground before. And his twist to go bigger means that we lose some of the personal details and little snippets that give his early work a sense of intimacy and uniqueness. Where it becomes a problem is on tracks like, say, Mittens, where the chorus is, "We used to fit like mittens, but never like gloves." Not a bad line, and I get the meaning, but it feels a little bit goofy when sold with such unabashed power. It just comes across a little silly to me. And go a step further to songs like Josephine, probably the weakest track on this album, which calls back to historical figures like Napoleon and Beethoven, who had partners named Josephine to drive them to new heights in their art and their craft. But then we get the lyric, "I don't like to be needy, but needs must." Okay, not only is that not a very good line, it's surprisingly clumsy, and it's not alone the shaky technical songwriting here, and that was a little bit bothersome considering a lot of Frank Turner's best work is anchored in really good songwriting. And in a sense, it doesn't surprise me though. This is an album angling for a much bigger scope than previous albums. There's bound to be a couple slip-ups along the way. But what it does mean is that there's enough spots and a lack of overall unique texture that prevents it to rising to truly great status for me. It's not to say that Positive Songs for Negative People is a bad album, far from it. It's got a rock-solid foundation in writing, delivery, and composition that Butch Walker just puts on steroids, and that gets a strong 7 out of 10 for me. But I can't help but wish it was a little bit stronger, a little bit more diverse, a little bit more unique. I know Frank Turner can do that. So it's definitely worth checking out though. If Frank Turner is going to be double-crossing demons to get better, I'd be happy to help lift the weight of the world off his shoulders. And you should be too. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. You're wondering why my voice is like this? I think I'm coming down with something in my throat. Hopefully it won't affect any future recordings. I got Billboard Breakdown tomorrow. Want to be on my game. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.